Okay.
Looking for my It's weird. I'm having a hard time getting my PowerPoint tab to show up in my list of open windows. Just give me a sec.
Don't worry.
See if I reopen it, if it will catch on. Oh, there we go. That extra moment. Let somebody else get in.
There.
All right, there we go.
Mm-hmm.
I'm really struggling to get that PowerPoint to appear. I keep having all my other windows are available for me to choose from. Maybe I need to close more of my other windows so that it comes up.
Yeah, because that didn't happen the other sessions.
Yeah, no, I don't know why my PowerPoint is not showing up. I'll just try.
Maybe if you bounce out, and come back in, that might be available. I don't know.
Yeah, that might make sense.
Maybe.
I'll try one more time. And I'm going to bounce out and come back in.
Okay. So we're about to start.
Yeah. Great. There he is.
Yeah.
Hey, Kristeva has agreed to give a lecture for us. I told you already, didn't I, Pancho?
Yeah, for the conference, right?
Yeah.
That's great news.
And Sawyer's in Naples eating pizza. I'm sure he's eating pizza. He's got to. Are you sick of pizza yet, Sawyer?
You're mute, Benjamin.
There we are.
There.
Okay. There we go. We can hear and see me, right?
Yep.
All right. So today we're doing part 3 on equality. A little bit of a refresh from the last couple sessions. 3 parts of a legitimation story. State Act X is justified by a legitimating abstraction, Y, understood through a conceptualization, Z. So last session we talked about liberty as a legitimating abstraction and different conceptualizations of liberty that justify the actions of states or are used to try to justify the actions of states. Today we're doing it with equality, where equality is the legitimating abstraction. We're going to discuss different conceptualizations of equality and some of the issues that come up, right? So we did liberty last time, we're doing equality this time, and then representation will be next week. So in ancient Athens, before Athenian democracy was instituted, the ancient Athenian state was legitimated through the abstraction of eunomia. Eunomia tends to be translated in English as good order. And in antiquity, it's associated with hierarchy. Everything in its place, everything where it belongs, everything being treated the way it should, with an attentiveness to the ways in which different people differ from one another or deserve to be treated in different ways. Isonomia is introduced to frame Athenian democracy as consistent with, or in some ways better than, eunomia. So isonomia achieves what eunomia achieves by other means. And it tends to be translated in English, at least by recent scholarship, as equal order. And it's associated with an equal distribution of political power, with no one person or faction able to rule. So whereas in eunomia, the right people are in charge, in isonomia, nobody is in charge because power is distributed throughout the city. Now, for more on that distinction, you might check out John Lombardini. He had a piece in the academic journal History of Political Thought on how isonomia evolved to deal with eunomia. Because, of course, from the point of view of someone who's a subscriber of eunomia, isonomia seems to just be anarchic because it doesn't recognize that there is some particular class that ought to be doing the ruling. Right? So in its very first instantiation, equality is to do with a kind of equal distribution of political power. Now, even this concept of isonomia has been picked up and played with by other political theorists, most famously Friedrich Hayek. So Friedrich Hayek, the right libertarian Austrian school thinker, argued that isonomia was not an equal distribution of political power, but that it was equality before the law. And he found this view in the work of Aristotle. And while Aristotle does discuss equality before the law, Aristotle does not use the term isonomia when he's discussing equality before the law. And Aristotle comes much later than many of the theorists who used isonomia to legitimate or to justify the Athenian political system. By the time Aristotle is writing, Athens is becoming part of Alexander the Great's empire. So that's after the classical period and at the start of the Hellenistic period in Greece. Nevertheless, on Hayek's view, the law applies equally to all, but all do not necessarily have equal political power. And by suggesting that this is the kind of equality that the Greeks meant, Hayek is able to say that when we use equality today, we ought to be using it in this sense, this equality before the law sense. Right? Now, these are really very two different ways of understanding equality. Equal participation in rule is much more involving and much more demanding than equality before the law. And in revolutionary France, where equality became a very central concept in the new French Republic's legitimation stories, there was this question of, well, how should equality be conceptualized? Should it be conceptualized in this more antique equal participation in rule sense, or should it be conceptualized more narrowly as equality before the law? Now, the trouble with equal participation in rule is once you let everybody participate, you then have to ask questions like, does everybody have the virtues, the qualities necessary to participate effectively? If you think that everyone does, you then have this question about how do you design institutions that everyone can actually be part of, right? If you have a set of elections to pick a set of representatives, well, then the people who get votes, they're going to have a lot more participation than the people who are doing the voting. The person who actually gets to go and show up and participate in parliament, they have a larger participatory role than the people who vote for them. And the people who vote have a more participatory role than the people who aren't voting. The people who are donating money or lending support to candidates in elections, who have the resources to lend support, who control newspapers, those people all participate more than the people who don't have those resources or don't do those things. So for this reason, in France, it was argued by people who supported equal participation rule that elections themselves were counter-egalitarian, because elections mean that the representatives get to participate more than the represented, and they mean that the people who have the resources to contribute to campaigns participate more than the people who don't. They argued instead that democracy should be based on sortition, where you pick the people to fill offices out of a hat. If you pick people to fill offices out of a hat, everybody has the same chance of being picked, regardless of what their background is, how much money they have, what qualities they have. Because if you really think that everybody has the virtues necessary to participate, well then, why do you need to have an election? Why do we need to choose one person over another? Right? If everyone really is equal, then anybody you pick out of a hat is just as good as anybody else you might pick out of a hat. Right? Now, if you say that that's not the case, that we're not that equal, that it does matter who we pick, well, then we have to provide for the kind of education that would be necessary to enable everybody to participate equally. And if that's the case, then we're going to have to structure the whole society around meeting this demand for equal education. And that's going to mean intervening in lots of different aspects of life that previously states didn't think of themselves as having to intervene in, or that states were prepared to outsource to the church. That's very demanding. It's hard to legitimate a state if you're saying that the state has got to actually prepare everybody to rule well in the kind of sense that, say, ancient political theorists would think about civic education. Ancient political theorists tend to think that civic education has to be very, very developed and elaborate, just as they think the education you need to be free or to have liberty is very, very developed or elaborate. And because it's so developed and elaborate, it's hard to make it something everybody can access. It takes so much time. It takes, it is incompatible with doing ordinary kinds of work and having an ordinary kind of schedule. However, equality before the law has problems too. And here I've got a quote up from Robert Dahl, a post-war liberal political theorist. But this quote, I think, really captures what goes wrong with equality before the law. Dahl writes, "Once a social or political principle becomes firmly embedded in the political culture, it can serve quite literally as an axiom from which new, unanticipated, and seemingly inescapable conclusions can be drawn. The functions originally fulfilled by a principle, the interests initially served by it, can no longer control or dominate the conclusions to be drawn from it. Beliefs about political equality and inequality often take on this axiomatic quality. Wherever principles of political equality were used by spokesmen for the middle classes to justify their entry into the political system, it was not long before spokesmen for excluded groups drew the logical consequences, showed the inconsistency of the exclusion, and insisted that middle-class governments had to honor their own sacred principles or lose their legitimacy. In fact, certain clusters of political beliefs so regularly show up in different circumstances that they appear almost to reflect the necessity with which certain conclusions follow from certain premises. To believe in political equality among a large association of people seems to carry with it, as if by implication, a number of principles. To make the same point more cautiously, the attempt to devise principles consistent with political equality narrows the choice down to a very much smaller subset." Right? So equality before the law tends not to fully satisfy people. And if you try to build a society around equality before the law, people will tend to conceptualize equality in more demanding ways and try to use those more demanding conceptions to pressure the state. At the same time, if the state gives in and adopts more demanding conceptualizations of equality, those conceptualizations will be radically out of step with what the state is actually doing. And those conceptualizations will be very hard to use to tell convincing legitimation stories. Nevertheless, in France, equality before the law prevailed. So here we have Abbé Sieyès, who played a very significant role in theorizing the conception of equality that would be used by most European democracies in the 19th and 20th centuries. And Siey's idea is you abolish the privileges of the nobility, so you make the former nobles equal in political rights to everybody else, but then you make a distinction between active and passive citizens. So the active citizens participate in politics to varying degrees, but the passive citizens do not participate in politics. They don't get suffrage, but they're equal in the sense that they're still protected by the law. So if you're a French citizen, but you don't have any property, or you're a French citizen, but you're a woman, you can't vote, but you're meant to be equal before the law in the sense that the law is meant to protect your rights just as much as it would protect the rights of an active citizen. Now, that conception has a lot of tensions in it. And in many ways, it's a kind of compromise conception meant to appease different constituencies during the revolutionary period. It's not something that can operate without changing across generations. There are too many tensions in it, and it's too obvious that the active-passive distinction contradicts the principle that it's meant to expound. So what tends to happen after this, in the last couple hundred years, is that equality gets associated with justice, right? Now, ancient political theorists make lots of references to justice, including theorists who are not very keen on political equality, like, say, Plato. When justice gets brought up in antiquity, it is more like eunomia. It tends to have something to do with ensuring people get what they deserve, treating equals equally and unequals unequally, administering justice to wrongdoers, as in criminal justice. Justice in antiquity is often a legitimating abstraction in its own right. A king who rules justly rather than arbitrarily, or who rules in accordance with law rather than by diktat or by whims. Those can be ways of justifying the rule of kings in ancient and medieval monarchies. However, in the wake of this equality before the law conceptualization, justice in modernity comes to mean that every person is equal and deserves the same treatment in some sense, rather than each person getting what they deserve in a differentiated way. And the modern state tends to deliver an unsatisfying form of equal treatment, something which doesn't fully realize this principle, right? So justice, therefore, becomes a quest to align the state with more demanding conceptualizations of equality. So it becomes a kind of never-ending journey that we say that the state is on or that society is on. In antiquity, justice is something you go and get from somebody. You go to the ruler, you tell the ruler the problem, you tell the ruler what your grievance is, what somebody did, and the ruler administers justice. And we still have that kind of language when we talk about criminal justice, getting justice for something, right? Or getting justice for someone. But when justice is associated with equality, it's not something you go and get, it's something that you're kind of chasing after, pursuing. And a great example of that kind of language is the famous Martin Luther King quote, "The arc of the moral universe is long, but it bends toward justice." Right? This idea that justice is somewhere that you're going rather than something you can go and get right now. So, theories of distributive justice in the last 50, 60 years or so have become very popular in the academy. And there have been lots and lots of different positions that have been articulated. I'll walk you through some of the more prominent views, some of the more prominent questions that come up. The thing that is really distinctive about academic conceptualizations of equality is that there are so many of them, and it is very difficult to make any progress in any of these arguments. Certainly, there have been papers where people will take positions, and those positions will be regarded as interesting. But to draw a line under all of this and say, we've made progress, we now know what equality is, we now know what justice is, now we can implement it, We never get there. We never get there because equality is constantly being partitioned into more and more and more conceptualizations, all of which conflict with one another. So the first question, what's the currency of justice? The currency of justice question is to do with what it is that we're trying to give everybody. Are we trying to make sure everybody has the same amount of welfare, well-being, happiness? Is it resources like wealth or income? Or maybe it's certain kinds of treatment? Is it capabilities? Are we trying to make sure everyone ends up able to do certain things? For instance, able to be free in some sense. Is it opportunities? Are we giving everyone a chance to compete for some set of jobs on the basis maybe of merit or desert? Is it needs? Are we just trying to make sure everybody's needs are met, their basic needs defined in some more minimal kind of way? That question alone, the currency of justice question, produces huge numbers of arguments. And you may have heard the kind of equality of outcome versus equality of opportunity kind of binary argument, similar to what we talked about last week, how sometimes binary arguments are used to give a feeling of there being a rich conceptual discussion when really you're kind of collapsing a debate down into two things. The outcome versus opportunity debate is a kind of way of crunching down the currency of justice question into two things so that you can say, the left wants equality of outcome and the right wants equality of opportunity. Now, even that is highly distortive because there are lots of people who want other things apart from outcome in a generalized sense, or who think we need to be more specific about what outcome concretely means. And there are people on the right who don't think equality of opportunity is something which ought to be pursued, who have more fundamental issues with the concept of equality or the use of equality in legitimation stories, or who want something much more basic like just equality before the law, right? So that two-way debate that you'll often see in the media is a kind of pale imitation of the currency of justice literature. Now, that's just one strand of this stuff, right? Because then we have this other question, who is being equalized? Are we talking about human beings, that all human beings are equal by virtue of being human? Are we talking about citizens? Are we saying that equality is a political or a civic concept that should be applied within a state to the particular members of that state? Are we talking about classes? Are we saying that the proletariat should be equal to the bourgeoisie in some sense? Are we talking about global justice? Are we talking about different peoples, nations, states? Are we talking about the global north versus the global south, or the first world and the third world? Are we talking about groups? Are we trying to equalize genders, races, ethnicities? Are we talking about human and non-human animals? Are we trying to equalize human beings with animals, or non-human animals with horses and dogs and wild animals of all kinds? Are we talking about living things? And some people talk about deep ecology, or kind of panpsychism, in which consciousness is attributed to all matter or to all particles. You can apply the principle of equality to particles if you take a metaphysical position like panpsychism seriously, and suggest that in some way, shape, or form we ought to include minerals or plants in our political conception. So there's every kind of position you can imagine about who is being equalized. And oftentimes, people don't really sit down and decide which of these views they have. You'll see people sometimes treat one of these things as important, at other times a different thing. There are lots of people you'll find out there who will make appeals to the idea that all human beings are equal, but at other times they want to talk about groups, genders, or races. You'll find people who sometimes want to talk about peoples, nations, and states. People often shift which language they're using. Academics do debate these questions. And one thing I left off there is future people, people who don't yet exist. If you've been listening to the discussions recently about long-termism or about effective altruism, those people hold the view that we ought to be including people who do not yet exist that we can reasonably predict might yet come into existence in our conception. Another argument that sometimes gets brought up is if we discovered a planet with a species of intelligent life on it that lived in destitution, would we have a duty to apply the distributive principle to those people and include those people in it? If they're much poorer than us on average, do we have to redistribute welfare, resources, capabilities, opportunities, etc., to them? Right? So the who is being equalized question adds endless complexity to this debate, because if you're operating from the position of citizens or groups within a particular state versus different states or human beings writ large or animals, plants, you're going to get completely different notions of what you should actually do. Then there's the third question: what's the distributive principle? So oftentimes when the concept of equality gets used, we think that it's being used in a strict egalitarian sense, literally giving everybody the same things. But sometimes it's not used in that sense. Some political theorists argue that utilitarianism actually incorporates equality in a more appropriate way, because utilitarians take the pleasure or pain of every person seriously, with equal weight. Of course, the thing about utilitarianism is it's not interested in equalizing people. It's interested in valuing the experiences equally. And that might be another thing that you could add into the who is being equalized category. Experiences for utilitarianism are what counts and what you treat as the thing that you have to consider as equal, rather than particular people, because the utilitarian doesn't care which particular people get the experiences or whether the experiences stack up in an uneven way, with some people getting more and some less. So utilitarianism is, in a sense, an egalitarian view, but in a very odd sense. Then you've got prioritarianism. The prioritarian argues that you should distribute in such a way that you give priority to the worst off, so that whoever would be worst off is in the best possible position. This is a view that is associated, for instance, with John Rawls. So the prioritarian will tolerate some level of inequality if that inequality benefits whoever is the worst off, right? The sufficientarian position is less common, but it's a view that is kind of similar to the currency of justice views that are focused around needs. The sufficientarian says you distribute in such a way that everyone gets enough, but you tolerate inequalities above that threshold. So a sufficientarian says that you've got to distribute in such a way that all needs are met, but other things beyond that can be unequal. Then the last debate I want to briefly familiarize you with is the question of why. Why is equality the thing that matters? So some political theorists argue that equality has intrinsic value, that it's valuable for its own sake, that it is just as valuable as, say, liberty or freedom. Others argue that it has non-intrinsic value, that we don't value it for its own sake, but because it helps us get something else. And one thing you might notice is that a lot of these conceptualizations of equality can be used to deliver things that might expand access to liberty. And so what we'll often find is that political theorists who are having trouble getting their conceptualization of liberty to be popular or to obtain will try to achieve that conceptualization of liberty through some conceptualization of equality. And they'll try to move the debate so that they're talking in terms of equality instead of liberty, where their position is more tractable or can get more of a hearing. Great example of a non-intrinsic view would be Martin O'Neill, who in 2008 wrote an article about non-intrinsic egalitarianism. It's a popular argument to use if you're facing what's called the leveling down objection. The leveling down objection to equality states that you shouldn't distribute in such a way that you make some people worse off without making anybody better off, right? So if you are just trying to achieve, say, strict egalitarianism, then you would move toward equality by taking things away from people who have stuff, even if you then set those things on fire and didn't give them to people who are worse off. So someone issuing the leveling down objection wants to say, aha, doesn't this prove that equality isn't what is valuable? Doesn't this mean that strict egalitarianism is wrong? Martin O'Neill argues that it's more complicated than this because equality has an instrumental value, that it has further purposes to it beyond just the achievement of equality as such. And therefore, sometimes moving toward strict egalitarianism or leveling down might be appropriate because of these other knock-on effects that you might not be taking into account when you're just considering the revocation of whatever it is that you consider valuable, whichever currency of justice it is, from the people who have a lot of that thing. Now, that's a very brief and somewhat rushed introduction to a lot of different things. So I wouldn't expect all of those things to go into your head. The function of talking about all of them here is just to point out really quickly, there are way too many conceptualizations of this for people to agree on any one of them. And if you think that you're going to get everybody to converge on one particular conceptualization of equality, you're really barking up the wrong tree. Right? And some of these conceptualizations are much more demanding than others. So here I've given you a couple of charts, both of which show equality in some sense. So in the first chart, we have individual equality of welfare, right? So here, we have strict egalitarianism. Everybody is equal, is equally well off. The thing that we're equalizing is individuals, and the currency that we're equalizing is welfare, right? Strict egalitarian, individual equality of welfare. Regardless of race, regardless of class, everybody's got the same welfare, right? In the second chart, we have race-based equality of welfare. So on this chart, the white and black races are equal, but there's still class inequality, right? So if your view is that all we're trying to achieve is group equality, rather than say equality all the way down to the individual level, then you can have a lot of stratification within the groups, provided that the same parts, percentages or deciles or classes within the groups, provided those classes, the top, the middle, and the bottom, are equal. And this little game of bait and switch happens a lot in the United States, where you'll think that you're talking about equality to do with individuals or to do with classes, but you're just talking about it to do with groups. And people will make the case that, well, if you make sure that the same percentage of white people, men, women, black people, straight people, gay people are rich, and the same chunk are poor, the same percentages proportionally, then you've achieved equality. And that brings me to this discussion of equity. So equity has recently in the United States become a really hot topic term, to the point where if you apply for political theory jobs in the United States, they will often say, oh, we want somebody who talks about equity. We want somebody who cares about DEI, diversity, equity, and inclusion. And when equity was getting its start in this discussion, it was often introduced with this chart. Now, in this chart, you get a binary, right, where equality is associated with giving everybody the same thing, regardless of whether it actually helps them get where they're looking to go. Whereas equity is associated with getting everybody the same result. So equality here is a kind of equality of resources. Everybody gets the same resource, the box. And equity here is associated with equality of welfare or equality of capability. Everybody's able to watch the game. Everybody gets the same quality, experience, or welfare of watching the game. Now, this is much simpler than all of this, right? And importantly, the purpose of the chart is to say that equality is not good enough because equality leaves some people unable to watch the game, but equity is. So it's straightforwardly saying anything that goes under the name equality only achieves the situation of equality of resources. And the only way that you can get equality of welfare or equality of outcome is to do equity rather than equality, right? So it's a kind of word sorcery that excludes all the conceptualizations of equality apart from equality of welfare or equality of capability, right? So in some ways, this is a kind of powerful tool because, you know, this is too much complexity. You're never going to get everybody to agree on one particular conceptualization if you actually walk them through all of the different ways in which we can conceptualize this term. If we actually take seriously the immense variety of ways we can think about it, we'll never get anybody to agree. But if you collapse it down into a binary, you can try to shunt everybody into one particular view by framing all the other views as verboten or tainted or inadequate. Right? So where did it come from? Well, the concept of equity originated in education theory. And in its original use, it was used to point out that if you treat all students in precisely the same way, they won't all reach the same level of ability, right? If you're teaching a class of children how to read and you treat them all in precisely the same way and give them all the same amount of time and attention, some of them will learn to read and some of them won't, right? Therefore, teachers should treat different students in different ways. They should give more time to the students who need more attention so that those students also learn how to read, so that everybody reaches the standard for reading at their grade level. That is a relatively common sense idea. It makes good sense that a teacher in a classroom should make sure that all the students are able to read rather than treat every student in precisely the same way, leaving some of them unable to read. Now, this spread from the education discipline into the rest of the humanities and social sciences. And in its original usage, it is very similar to equality of welfare, equality of capability for individuals. It's a highly demanding conceptualization of equality. If we're saying that we're not just trying to get everybody to be able to read, we're saying that everybody should be able to participate in politics, that everybody should be literate in science or technology, that everybody should be able to acquire a set of virtues or engage with high culture. Very quickly, this can become one of those very demanding kinds of equality that states don't like. So initially, in its initial form, it is a radical and subversive concept, right? But just like those more demanding conceptions of equal distribution of political power, you start getting these questions to do with demandingness and to do with, can a state actually achieve this principle conceptualized in this way? Teachers can't make up for inequity in other parts of society. You have to start worrying about inequity in the home, inequity in the workplace. You're crushing out all these other conceptualizations of equality that many, at least political theorists, consider important or interesting. And they're viewing this as a propagandistic crushing out of their cognitive value diversity. And the central issue, I think, that you have to come back to is that this conceptualization of equity just makes very heavy demands on the state, very heavy demands that the state's really going to struggle to meet. If you were to ask, how does the state achieve this kind of equity? It's a very difficult thing, even to articulate what precisely the policy schema would be, what configuration of institutions or structures you'd have. So it doesn't make life easy on the state. And therefore, it doesn't suit the state to tell legitimation stories that frame equity in this kind of way. So what do? Well, you have to start watering it down. You have to say, well, we're not trying to achieve equity for individuals, but groups. And we're not trying to equalize welfare, but wealth. And you have to get it back to this idea that if the oligarchs are diverse, equity has been achieved. If the same percentage of rich people are black and white as in the general population, if the same percentage are men and women as in the general population, then you've achieved equity, and you don't have to do anything further beyond that, right? So the way you do this is by reaching back into this bag and moving from welfare to wealth, and moving from individuals, human beings, citizens, to groups, genders, races. And the thing is, because it's been conceptualized as a binary, and because the people who are using the term have not been familiarized with all those different ways of conceptualizing the term, they're vulnerable to this. They're not aware that the term is being shifted under their feet in ways that make it much less tractable for the radical project that they're trying to use it for. Right? So who's doing this? Who is watering down equity and making it into this kind of term? So I give you a few different examples of organizations in the United States that are involved in this watering down. So one is Race Forward, which publishes a popular publication called Color Lines. And they define equity as a process of eliminating racial disparities, right? So there you've got to focus on groups, and we're talking about disparities. Disparity increasingly is defined as it not being the case that all of the races end up distributed throughout society in broadly the same way. So again, coming back to this idea of equality of wealth for races. The Center for American Progress, which is a liberal-leaning DNC-linked think tank, previously presided over by Neera Tanden, by Podesta, by a number of people who are very heavily linked in with the Biden administration. They frame equity explicitly as about closing a racial wealth gap. And racial equity tools, which is a kind of diversity, equity, and inclusion consulting and education outfit. It supplies educators or consultants with tools they can use when they go to firms or companies or into schools and they try to teach this material to students. They say that equity is, quote, the condition that would be achieved if one's racial identity no longer predicted in a statistical sense how one fares. That's a very precise formulation, and it very clearly frames equity as a group equality thing, not an individual equality thing, and makes it therefore much easier to achieve. Now, there's still some variety here in whether you're tying it to wealth gap or whether you're tying it to welfare. But even if you're framing it in terms of welfare, you can still get this heavily stratified outcome where your middle and bottom third are much worse off than your top third because the groups that you're paying attention to, black and white, are equal. So what about the American state? Those are organizations that pressure the state, and the Center for American Progress is very linked into DC and is a place that many people who work in government spend time. It's a place where, especially if you're out of power in the United States, Democratic operatives, if there's a Republican president, will tend to spend time working in the liberal think tanks when they're out of power as a way of continuing to be employed when their party's not in government. How does the state define it? So I'm going to give you a few quotes from President Biden's executive order on advancing racial equity and support for underserved communities through the federal government, released in January of 2021. So that executive order says, the term equity means the consistent and systematic, fair, just, and impartial treatment of all individuals, including individuals who belong to underserved communities that have been denied such treatment, such as Black, Latino, and Indigenous and Native American persons, Asian Americans and Pacific Islanders and other persons of color, members of religious minorities, lesbian, gay, bisexual, transgender, and queer LGBTQ+ persons, persons with disabilities, persons who live in rural areas, and persons otherwise adversely affected by persistent poverty or inequality. The term underserved communities refers to populations sharing a particular characteristic, as well as geographic communities that have been systematically denied a full opportunity to participate in aspects of economic, social, and civic life as exemplified by the list in the preceding definition of equity. So there you have the list is being used twice here. So the list is in the definition of equity, but it's also being used to explain underserved communities. You have a number of different important political theory value-laden terms here: fair, just, impartial, denied a full opportunity, but these terms are not defined. So the definition that's being used in the executive order invokes a lot of other terms that the executive order then fails to define. Those terms, of course, can be conceptualized in very different ways. And at many points in this definition, we have appeals to different kinds of language. So sometimes we're talking about individuals, sometimes we're talking about underserved communities, sometimes we're talking about treatment, impartial treatment. That sounds like equality before the law. Sometimes we're talking about a full opportunity, right? Sometimes we're talking about being able to participate in economic, social, and civic life. Well, that's a list of 3 things. So clearly those mean 3 different things, but we don't know what any of them mean because none of them are defined. Right? So my point here is that the administration pretends to be interested in defining equity, but is really just making a word salad out of it. And the reason the administration is making a word salad out of it is that it doesn't want to be held to any particular definition. So its definition includes language that potentially gestures at almost any conceptualization of equity that you might have. So if you like the Biden administration and you read this document, you can find your conceptualization of equity in it. The problem is that lots of other conflicting conceptualizations of equity are also invoked in the same document. So if you then try to say, hey, you said that you were going to treat all individuals the same way, it can then say, well, really, we're talking about underserved communities. This is an order on racial equity. And if you say, well, shouldn't we be concerned about welfare? Well, it also says denied a full opportunity to participate in aspects, right? There's all sorts of room here for the administration to play games, and it's worded in such a way that the administration really can't succeed or fail to meet any of the standards or criteria that it's set out. Right? In this order, the Office of Management and Budget is instructed to study the best methods consistent with applicable law to assist agencies in assessing equity with respect to race, ethnicity, religion, income, geography, gender identity, sexual orientation, and disability. So in the bureaucratic gobbledygook, you tell one of the parts of the government to further study how to further define the term that the executive order is itself meant to address. It's one of the worst written executive orders I've ever seen in my life. And it just shows absolute contempt for academic political theory. There is no effort at all to be clear. And it's very clear that they're not at all interested in clarity. Now, this problem with the way that equality tends to be conceptualized, it's a problem that has been observed before, and it's frustrated a lot of Marxists. So to give you a couple of examples of kind of Marxist critiques of equality or of its equality's emancipatory potential, I have a couple quotes here from Marx and Engels. So Engels thinks equality just tends to confuse workers. He writes, the concept of a socialist society as a realm of equality is a one-sided French concept deriving from the old liberty, equality, fraternity, a concept which was justified in that in its own time and place, it signified a phase of development, but which, like all the one-sided ideas of earlier socialist schools, ought now to be superseded, since they produce nothing but mental confusion, and more accurate ways of presenting the matter have been discovered. Of course, what that then invites you to ask is, well, what are the more accurate ways of presenting the matter? Well, Marx argues that it ought to be framed in terms of liberty or in terms of non-slavery or non-domination. And he says, it was made clear that the wage worker has permission to work for his own subsistence, that is, to live, only insofar as he works for a certain time gratis for the capitalist, and hence also for the latter's co-consumers of surplus value, that the whole capitalist system of production turns on the increase of this gratis labor by extending the working day or by developing the productivity, that is, increasing the intensity or labor power, etc., that consequently the system of wage labor is a system of slavery, and indeed of a slavery which becomes more severe in proportion as the social productive forces of labor develop, whether the worker receives better or worse payment. Now, the trouble there is that Marx's solution to the issues with equality is to go back to talking about liberty and slavery and the sense in which we might say that the worker isn't free. But liberty is also a mess, as we discussed last week. It's very difficult to use liberty, and all sorts of games can be played to make that term hard to understand and hard to use for emancipatory purposes. So earlier we discussed how if you can't get your conceptualization of liberty to work, you will often pivot to equality and start trying to use equality as a non-intrinsic tool for getting at your conceptualization of liberty. But here we see Marx make the opposite move and say, hey, instead of talking about equality because equality produces too much of a mess, let's go back to talking about liberty. And so the radicals in this debate are constantly caught between these different legitimating abstractions, unable to find any conceptualization with which they can use to really articulate convincingly a set of demands that the state can be made to meet. And in this way, these debates help the state to keep itself humming along. As long as we're caught up in these debates, we are not able to clearly and straightforwardly articulate a fixed, precise set of demands on the state that are comprehensible to everybody. As soon as we start trying to do that, this game of how we conceptualize the term produces all sorts of internal division within radical movements, and eventually produces conceptualizations that are watered down. And those watered down conceptualizations succeed because they are backed by organizations of these kinds, wealthy organizations with huge amounts of money from rich people. Those organizations make interventions in these debates to break down conceptualizations that are demanding and make them more amenable to the state, make them more compatible with the state's legitimation needs. And that's where I'll end for today, so we can go to questions.
Thank you, Benjamin. That was really interesting. I don't know if there are any questions, ideas, comments that you would like to ask. Well, while you are thinking, I have maybe two questions. One, I don't know if it's a question or a comment or something that you make me think a lot on the use of equality in US today. Like it's used for both sides, like kind of a weapon, or I don't know if a weapon, but like a support for the own discourses. And I was thinking specifically in, for example, like this dichotomy between Black Lives Matter and Blue Lives Matter or White Lives Matter. Like when you have Black Lives Matter, it's like the equality in relation of historical treatment, historical condition. There is kind of a speech that is linked to the reality and the historical reality of this group, and for me it's completely like accurate. But you have the other side that using the same like equality, like no, but all life matters, like there is no difference, we are all equal, but it's used kind of a response to validate themselves in relation to the other, but both use like equality, like the support for that, with completely different approaches to that. And I think that's really interesting because, as you were saying, like they understand equality in a complete different way. So even if they are used the same word, there is no connection there. And the other thing that I was thinking that I don't know if you know, because I'm completely ignorant in that, but I have read some things from more political anthropologists in relation to maybe other conceptions that indigenous and native nations in US have about how to configure society to reject hierarchy, authoritarian dynamics, even the state, with not the use of equality or liberty, but with different dynamics. So my question is, if some of those discussions or approaches to from a more practical perspective in how you can create a community have reached this more academical discussion about equality and liberty.
Yeah, those are both really fun questions. Yeah, one of the things that the right tends to do at this point in the States is it will say, well, the left is talking about groups, but we're talking about all individuals. But then it will have a notion of the currency of justice that is less ambitious alongside that. So they'll say, oh, all individuals should be made equal in terms of opportunity, or all individuals should be made equal before the law. And they'll try to position their view as more radical or more emancipatory because it's all individuals. And they'll say, well, the left is only talking about groups. And that has been used, I think, to pitch the right's view as more demanding than it really is. Conversely, because liberals in the United States increasingly use the group language, their view often is less demanding than it used to be, and looks less demanding to other people.
Hey, Benjamin, I have a question. Can you hear me okay?
Yeah.
Yeah, cool. So I really, well, first off, I've listened to your podcasts with Nina Power and Helen Rollins, and this is just my first kind of time jumping into this lecture, but this is a really, or the seminar that you're doing, but the lecture is good. I have a question about, so that equality, equity poster, a few years ago, I was a teaching fellow, and I remember seeing that poster. And I guess I'm just kind of, my question has to do with, I think, right now, especially in public education, we're seeing, on the one hand, a lot more homeschool, a lot more privatization on the one hand with the right. And then, I live in Colorado, and a lot of property tax fuels the schools, so where people live. So your public school districts get basically funded by how much you're paying in property tax. It's kind of a but so I guess I'm just kind of wondering, what are your thoughts on these conceptions and forms of equality as it relates to public education, and what do you think is needed to sort of reverse what's going on right now, which is on the one camp more privatization and moving towards the right kind of having complete domain and control over their education, and then I think in a lot of ways public schools not getting enough funds to sort of provide adequate sort of solutions for families that can't afford that.
Yeah, advocates of private schools have certainly used the idea that the public schools are pushing a particular kind of propagandistic narrative as a device for weakening the public school system and creating more energy for privatization in the States. I think this is also, the universities in particular are responding to this by cutting the humanities back in the States. So we've seen, for instance, in the United States, a 50% reduction in the last 10 years in humanities undergraduate enrollment. So fewer people are sending their kids to do humanities degrees because they think that they're propagandistic or not helpful. And then universities are cutting back those departments and shrinking them in size. So it has two effects. One is that it drags more people into the private sector as they try to get away from what they think of as not real education. And then two, the universities respond by just shedding the humanities and shrinking down the set of stuff that they provide. So we end up in a situation where it just becomes harder for state-run universities to even have political theory in their departments. It becomes harder to have humanities departments in these universities because of this outside pressure. And so the quality gets worse on both sides of the line. Both you have more people going into a private sector which is not interested in interrogating this stuff, and then the people who do stay in, there are fewer of them. It's shrinking all the time, and it becomes more stressful and harder for people to be in the academic sector in the States because of this pressure, and in the public school sector. And so in the case of secondary education, you get teacher shortages because you do need people to teach social studies at the high school level. At the university level, I think the humanities departments are just shrinking. They're getting rid of more of them. And so there's still this huge surplus of academics who are unable to find work. But one thing that I think that we may see is some of those people going into the secondary system as a way of trying to find employment, because there's just so many university academics who now find that the departments are all smaller than they were when they started their PhDs, and there just isn't a lot of jobs in the States for them. So I think it's weakening it on both sides. I do want to, I realize I didn't really answer the question about indigenous conceptions of anarchism. I want to talk about that a little bit. Gandhi, I think, is a great example of someone who offers a critique of the modern state that's not based on liberty or equality, really, but instead based on religious tradition. Doing an episode of my other podcast, Political Theory 101, on Gandhi later today. I'm recording that, so it's on my mind. I think that stuff is in the academic discussion. We taught Gandhi's text, Hind Swaraj, at Cambridge to undergraduates. The thing is that undergraduate students, when they're confronted with those arguments, are often bothered by the sometimes primitivist implications of many of the kinds of anarchism that you see. It's interesting because on the one hand, undergraduate students are often drawn to the green politics and to the idea of doing something about climate change. But then when you get into what does it really mean to do degrowth, and some of Gandhi's critiques of, for instance, the railroads or the medical profession or the legal profession, once you get into those arguments about modernity as a technology servicing thing, then students tend to get their backs up and tend to want to demand the luxuries that. So it's interesting because students will sign up enthusiastically to do Gandhi, but then when they read Gandhi, they get upset, and sometimes they accuse departments of deliberately teaching anarchist or post-colonial theorists that are no good as a way of trying to prevent them from reading the good stuff. But in their minds, the good stuff is a lot more Western and a lot more liberal than the stuff that they're being assigned. So they're not as radical as they think they are, and then they confront it. And I'm seeing a lot of that. But so I wanted to answer that. I think I've got it.
Hi, Benjamin. Both last week with liberty and this week with equality. Again, it seems like it's to the advantage to the government's legitimacy that they emphasize a vulgarity form rather than the virtue driven. And it's to their advantage that there be the division among not just individuals, but dividing the individuals by emphasizing groups and genders and race. And so do these different groups and organizations, are they aware of this? That to a certain degree, they're shooting themselves in their own foot in terms of trying to achieve this, because it's reinforcing the division of the people who would be addressing the legitimacy of the government. And secondly, does the government actually support this? Like that time they concede certain things, knowing that by providing funding in that direction, they're creating a certain group of people, new adults that are going to think this way, which is going to further protect their legitimacy. Did I explain that okay?
Yeah, so I don't generally have the view that people are conscious about the roles they're playing in all of this. I think generally what happens is people pick up these conceptualizations from their networks, from their educational background, from their time at university, from the, they go to meetings with consultants who learn something from university. They pick up these concepts from the educational sessions taught by the consultants. Most people are not aware of the huge array of different ways of conceptualizing these terms. That's mostly confined to a pretty small academic literature.
Yeah, I certainly.
And and in the States in particular, that literature, you have to really get to grad school before you would be familiarized with it. In some British universities, you can get some of that in undergrad still, but in the States, generally, they won't give you all of that stuff in undergrad. And so I think most people are true believers and are trying to do their best and think that these conceptualizations are good and the right ones. But there is a kind of a pressure of the interests that somebody has. If you benefit from things being understood in a particular way, that tends to over time influence what you're likely to believe to be true.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
And so you can sincerely and with perfectly good intentions end up adopting a perspective which very much comports with your own material interests.
Mm-hmm.
Right? It doesn't have to be nefarious, but it tends to happen over time. If you work a particular job, over time you tend to think like the kind of person who works that job. It's not because you set out to put people who work your job over everybody else. It's just because over time you tend to have the perspective of the kind of person that you are. We are what we repeatedly do.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
Yeah, and that's how I'd frame it. That's not to say that nobody thinks about it like I'm thinking about it, or in ways that are similar to what I'm thinking about, but it's not scalable.
Mm-hmm.
We don't have the educational apparatus to make very many people familiar with all of this.
Yeah. So that makes sense. So then part B was the government, they're aware of this. And do they at times support these interests just to further water the public down that their legitimacy is not threatened, even though under the appearance of supporting racial equality? I believe this is what you've been saying. I'm looking to verify I'm following.
Yes. So historically, there are instances in which you can establish that the government has used members of the intelligence community to infiltrate radical organizations and spread views which cause confusion and conflict within those organizations. We have evidence that that has happened. We know that it's happened in the past. Of course, when it happens now, it's harder to have clear evidence for it. And oftentimes, mutual suspicion within radical groups becomes a problem. Just the idea that there could be infiltrators causes people to have these kinds of fights. And oftentimes, you'll have sincere disagreement that's based on coming to these views through your social networks or experience that people will think is the product of infiltration. One of the reasons we know about the infiltration is that knowing about it is itself divisive. It invites you to be suspicious of other people and to think that it happens far more often than perhaps it does. But the nature of what's going on now is that it's very difficult for anybody to say how much of what presently goes on is the result of the FBI and the CIA and organizations like that. We don't tend to get good information about that until much, much later on. For instance, a lot of what we know about Cold War espionage comes from the fact that the Soviet Union collapsed and its archive was opened. And so we could validate a lot of things that we couldn't find out from the Americans because that material was still classified through the Soviet archive. Or in the case of the British government with the 30-year rule, where after a certain period of time, information has to be declassified or made available to Freedom of Information requests. When you have rules like that, stuff eventually comes out, but never in time for it to be useful to someone who's trying to act in the here and now. So I want to be careful about saying, oh, yes, the state knows what it's doing and is infiltrating, because you can't prove that in the moment.
Mm-hmm.
History suggests that probably some amount of this is deliberate, but certainly not all of it. And you can't say with any certainty in any given situation here and now, right away, that it's deliberate or not deliberate. And so it's, I think, best to suspend judgment on the question of intent.
No, that's excellent. And can I understand when you're talking about infiltration, like agents, that we could say the same thing about funding or monetary support, that it's the same idea of what you just described?
Yes, sometimes organizations will deliberately use money to alter the course of other organizations, or particular rich people will give donations to organizations to alter their course. When they do that, of course, they will act as if they genuinely believe in the aims of the organization, and then gradually over time, they'll use the money to influence what people say. And it will be very difficult to tell whether those people are sincere, because of course, some rich people do have subversive views that don't accord with their ordinary class interests. You have to allow for the possibility that someone who's rich could want to support other kinds of political activity. And yet, oftentimes that can be a cover for an attempt to manipulate an organization. So you're, again, stuck in this situation of, if you take it overly seriously, you end up suspicious of everything everybody does, and it has a very negative effect on how you view the world. So I tend to say the best thing to do is suspend judgment rather than assume that something is happening. But of course, it would be naive to say it never happens or to assume that it never occurs.
That's excellent. So although this is to the advantage of, for legitimating the government, all this division, there's no clear evidence that action is being taken.
Yeah, there's evidence in the past in analogous circumstances that some amount of it was deliberate in, say, the 60s and 70s. Talking about that in relation to now is very hard. We can suppose that there's probably some level of deliberate interference, but yeah.
It sounds wise. Yeah, I appreciate that. Thank you.
I have another question. I'm just wondering, like, how you'd answer, like, the moving conversations away from morality claims, because I think, especially when we're talking about like D&I within companies, like I've done videos for companies that are, pushing D&I initiatives over here on the face in order to sort of like, accumulate like a moral currency or something like that. But to sort of disavow like a moral conversation to a moral audience would be kind of like unheard of. So I guess wondering, like, what are like, so like how do you sort of like move into a conversation around sort of equality and equity and things like that when we're not sort of also having moral stakes sort of like questions or that sort of panic? It's probably a hard question.
Yeah. Part of it is these companies, there are a couple of different functions of doing this in the corporate world. One, of course, is to say to people outside, you should come work for us because we're an inclusive company, or you should invest in us because we're inclusive. But another is also to get the people who work for you looking at themselves and each other and accusing themselves and each other of being the reason there's injustice, as opposed to the fact that you're working for a company where you're an employee and you have much less power than the company that hires you. So you're looking at your coworker as someone who might be doing injustice to you or might be perpetuating historical injustice to you or to others, instead of as an ally in challenging the boss or in challenging the overall corporate structure. It has a divide and conquer effect internally within firms. And that's part of why firms like to do it. It's not just that it looks good to an outsider or to graduates that they're looking to hire. That's not to say that everybody who implements this stuff is thinking about it in that way, but that's, again, something that will tend to lead you, the fact that it does benefit you, will tend to lead you to want to do it and to come up with rationalizations for doing it, even if you authentically and sincerely believe in those rationalizations. To get the discussion off of moralism, in the United States, it's very hard. In a previous session, we talked a little bit about the influence of Henry David Thoreau and Ralph Waldo Emerson and a kind of anarchism that is rooted in a sort of Protestant moralism in the States. There are a lot of people who are involved in this kind of liberal social justice politics who are ex-evangelical Protestant, who carry a lot of the ways of thinking about morality that they picked up from their religious experience into the political movement. So they will say, oh, I hate the way I was raised, and I hate the evangelical church I was brought up in, and I reject completely, all of that. But then a lot of the modes and patterns of thinking that they acquired, this stuff can be slotted into a lot of that, and so they don't get as far out of it as they'd like to think they've gotten. Which is, it's a sad thing. I'm very sympathetic to people in that situation.
I totally agree with
it's
you.
That's an education problem.
Yeah, that's sort of my background. I think that sort of structural analysis of things is really helpful in this sort of regards. But I didn't mean to cut you off.
Yeah, just I think if you're trying to get outside of the moralizing lens, if you start talking about its function, what does it do to think in this way? We start from this question about the legitimacy of the state. How does the state justify what it does? And how does a particular moral narrative that's about accusing yourself or your neighbor or your coworker, how does that help someone that's got a lot more power than any of those people, or some institution or structure that's much stronger than any of those people, maintain itself? And to think about moral discourses in terms of how they potentially uphold structures, rather than as devices for accusing other people or for asserting that you're better than other people. I think if you start with that framing of let's talk about how this structure maintains itself, it becomes more possible to get outside of that very individual blame and shame kind of frame. And that's why, for instance, with this series, I start with legitimacy of the state and how do these concepts fit into the state. If I instead started with the conceptual discussions, you might go, well, why are you giving the concept of equality and the concept of liberty such a hard time? Do you hate those things? Is it because you morally don't agree with those concepts, those abstractions? But if we instead start with legitimacy and go, hey, concepts and abstractions can fit into a powerful structure's narrative, that allows us to analyze them from a different point of view.
Yeah, and I was thinking, just with that discussion, how also it's kind of good for the state, this kind of blaming, because if there is inequality, someone is responsible for that. And I was remembering the study of Milgram, like obedience to authority, like how eventually the institution is the responsible for things, because people tend to blame other, and eventually it's the institution. So if the institution is responsible for inequality, they need to fix that. And even if you are question the nature of the state, you don't want to be responsible for other group to suffer or something like that. So you again put the power in the state, and okay, you need to fix it. So even if there is a questioning of that, you are again giving the power to that state to take responsibility and make something, not you, like the other. And I think that's also like maybe another side of the same thing. And just a little anecdote, like to talk about the intervention. Like a couple of years ago here in Austin, there was this news that I think 5 years ago, like an FBI agent was infiltrated in an anarchist bookstore. Like they just sell books and help the community with community meals and stuff like that. And there was like an FBI agent there, and it was a whole thing here. And also in Chile, in till recent years, that I know for people working in a couple of universities, you have like members of the intelligence agency going there like students, and they stay there, they infiltrate. So it's always happening, and it's so funny and interesting, but also clever how they infiltrate in things that seem really like naive or really like with any long-term impact, but they still doing it. And I remember like in the 60s, there was this project Camelot, when they sent 300 sociologists to Latin America, to Chile and Argentina, to live for 3 years and study the society, so they would be able to identify when the revolution was going to happen. And also the people that were young, but they project that they will become leaders in some point. And they kill actually a lot of like teenage, like a car accident, a suicide of people like 18, 19, that they were project to become something in the future. So it's really creepy, that side of things, of how you control the speech that goes around society to support your own narrative. So yeah, so those stories.
Yeah, definitely. Yeah, the difficult thing is we know so much about this happening in the past. We can start to assume that it's always occurring. And then if we assume it's always occurring, then we're always suspicious of everybody all the time. And that makes it very difficult to cooperate. So it's so difficult to say in any particular circumstance now that it's occurring. And that's why I tend to argue for suspending judgment. On the question of the state, of course, the state is making interventions into the culture on behalf of the powerful interests in society that influence the way the state itself is constructed. So the state, the representatives who make the decisions, the elected officials, they respond to electoral incentives. And at the beginning of the talk, I kind of referenced, there's an issue with electoral politics insofar as it empowers the people who have influence to the ability to influence the outcome of campaigns. And that tends to be wealthy actors. And it also tends to be not just people who say donate to campaigns, but people who can influence the performance of the economy, the way in which the leader is perceived, the way in which it appears that they're doing. So that can be, with media coverage, people who own or operate media companies or have very large media platforms. But also, say in a lot of European countries, bondholders play a very significant role in influencing state behavior, insofar as if there's a run on, say, the currency or debt of a country, that can have a very powerful effect in terms of embarrassing the government, making it impossible for them to win another election. So in the States, it works less that way because of the power of the United States and the size of its economy and the influence of the dollar. You can't just do a kind of run on the dollar and use that to control the government. But in the States, there is such a division of political power among all the different offices of the state that it's very difficult for the state to move in any particular direction. So the way of influencing politics in the United States is to create endless conflict so that nobody can accumulate enough offices to do anything in particular that you might find threatening or upsetting, rather than, say, to do a run on the currency and economically blackmail the state into conforming to what you consider to be responsible policymaking. So instead of the bondholder narrative that we see in, say, the Eurozone in the States, we tend to get much more focus on endless conflict in primaries, endless debates in Congress, nobody able to get along, nobody able to come together to do really anything, and a lockup.
That's great. Thank you very much, Benjamin. I think we are on time, so we can leave the session till here. And yeah, see you next week for the final talk. And thank you very much, everyone, for being here.
Yeah, excited to do representation next time. We'll wrap it up and have some fun.